Thank you for downloading the Food Chain Podcast, your weekly helping of the economics, science and culture of food. I'm Dan Saladino, and this programme is about one of the most intense food obsessions I've witnessed. And it's delicious.
I have spent nearly 2 decades exploring the realm of fermentation. I do not have a background in microbiology or food science. I'm just a food-loving, back-to-the-land generalist who became obsessed with fermentation, spurred by a voracious appetite, a practical desire for food not to go to waste, and a willful desire to maintain good health.
Sandor Katz's teachings and writings on fermentation have changed lives around the world. I'm about to tell his story because I think he can also change yours. He's what you might call a demystifier.
Sometimes I feel like a mad scientist, tending to as many as a dozen different bubbly fermentation experiments at once. Sometimes I feel like a game show host. Would you like to taste what's in crock number 1, or trade it for what lies buried in crock number 2? Sometimes I feel like a holy roller evangelist, zealously spreading the word about the glorious healing powers of fermented foods.
But all of his adventures in fermentation are driven by taste.
Beautiful. Very, very gentle heat to the cucumber. Is this your first pickle of the day?
Of the day, I had some sauerkraut with breakfast. Humans did not invent or create fermentation. It would be more accurate to state that fermentation created us.
First, let me set the scene. Our story unfolds in the American South, Tennessee. And whereas in the state capital, Nashville, where you'll see the bright lights of the bars on Broadway and hear the sounds of countless musicians, not so very far away, if you know where to drive, are some of the most remote homes imaginable. I've just been driving for an hour and a half away from Nashville along the interstate. I've just taken a turning into a forest up a hill towards a mountain. I'm heading to a property that's been described to me as off-grid, so there's no access to the electrical network or the water system. This is rural Tennessee, and in every direction, oaks and cedars, and the sun is shining through as it just seems to be getting thicker and deeper. No other cars or houses in sight. I've just driven past the only sign of life for a few miles, and that's a row of very old mailboxes, one of them peppered with bullet holes. Somebody's been practicing. How incredible. This forest canopy going up a mountain along a path to Sandor Katz's home. And I think this is Sandor now.
All right, welcome, you made it.
Hello, Sandor.
Hi. Great to meet you, Dan.
And you.
Welcome to 100% humidity.
That's Kitty, your dog.
Yeah. My name is Sandor Katz. I call myself a fermentation revivalist. I live here in Middle Tennessee.
In the middle of a forest is a spacious, beautiful wooden home that's like a shrine to the fermented foods of the world. Or should that be church?
Before we begin, I've noticed this one colourful window in your kitchen. It's a stained glass picture of reds, yellows, oranges. What is that image?
It is an image of bacteria, a photographic image through a microscope of some different kinds of bacteria.
And not that you would ever forget, but you can stand in your kitchen and the sun will be shining through this image of the microorganisms that are so much part of your world.
Yeah. Fermentation, broadly speaking, is the transformative action of microorganisms. So fermented foods and beverages are those foods and beverages that have been created by this transformative power of microorganisms. Some of the most famous examples would be bread, cheese, alcoholic beverages, salamis, pickles, sauerkraut. The list really goes on and on. Fermentation comes from the Latin fervere, which means to boil, and it's really because the visible action of fermentation is the bubbles that it produces in liquids. And fermentation has always been understood to be a form of cold boiling or cold cooking.
And so, in Sandor Katz's kitchen are glass jars, ceramic crocks, and wooden bowls full of food, many of them fizzing with the power of bacteria at work on an array of vibrant fruits, vegetables, herbs, and grains.
This bubbling crock has just been opened, or at least the cloth removed.
Sandor Katz, now in his mid-50s, has a mission in life. That's to get as many of us as possible to make that sound for ourselves, in our homes, inside our kitchens. And as I watch him lift lids and open jars, you can tell, even after decades of practice, he's still utterly fascinated and partly mystified by the process that creates this living, fizzing food.
Cultures must have revered or must have been amazed by what was unfolding in these different foods.
Sure. And also I think that's been a major realm of mysticism. Just the not knowingness has always made fermented foods and beverages special. There's lots of interesting examples of indigenous cultures organizing ritual around the practice of fermentation. And in some cases, like people would dance around whatever the liquid they're trying to get to ferment, and with the idea that they have to teach the ferment how to dance. Then some people have approached it in exactly the opposite way and created special spaces where the ferment could be protected from people's energy, and it was the idea that, like, you don't want to disturb the ferment. Everywhere in the world where indigenous cultures have survived, there are interesting rituals organized around fermentation.
In a clearing in the forest, we start to gather food. And as we collect fruit, my lessons in fermentation begin.
What do we have here?
This is a blueberry bush. If you look closely at the blueberries, you'll see this sort of powder on them. And this powder consists of yeast and various kinds of bacteria. And on all dark colored fruits, you can get a sense of that. The speculation is, how did people figure out fermentation, as if this was a technology that we had somehow invented? That's just the wrong question to ask, because fermentation is a natural phenomenon. It happens without us. Certainly, human culture has contributed to fermentation. We've created vessels, created reliable methods that we use, but berries on a bush will spontaneously start to ferment. Grapes on a vine that get damaged. Fermentation happens with us or without us.
And in another clearing in the forest, where Sandor Katz grows much of his food, there's an array of vegetables and fruits destined for deceptively simple but magical forms of fermentation, ones that will only require the addition of salt or a brine or even just cups of water.
What do we have before us?
Tomatoes, sweet potatoes, these are amaranths, squash, peppers, these are mostly like chili peppers, but our objective today is cucumbers. And these are, they're called lemon cucumbers, and they have a shape and color like a lemon. Okay, let's get a few more cucumbers, and then we can go in the house and pickle them.
In a moment, we'll hear Sandor demonstrate how powerful, healthy bacteria naturally present on all vegetables and fruits can be harnessed and guided in fermentation.
No matter how much we learn about bacteria, we're never going to know everything. And I think that, mysteries endure about fermentation and so much more.
You get the sense of why fermentation is so valuable when it comes to this abundance and ending up with so much arriving all at the same time.
Agriculture wouldn't be practical as a means of sustenance if people didn't have ideas about how to preserve food. And certainly fermentation is not the only one, but fermentation is a major ancient one.
But the story of how Sandor Katz's fermentation obsession began is one worth hearing.
I grew up in New York City on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in a 14th story apartment.
And growing up in a Jewish family, food was extremely important.
No one in my family was fermenting anything, but we lived just a couple of blocks away from a major iconic delicatessen called Zabar's. The pickles were always sold out of these barrels in a very kind of old world way. I was mostly familiar with sauerkraut from hot dog vendors on the street in New York. Sauerkraut is something they always offer as a topping.
By his 20s, Sandor had moved into the world of city politics and a blossoming career. And then everything changed.
In 1991, when I was 29 years old, I tested HIV positive.
His work and his political ambitions instantly lost all meaning.
The minute I tested HIV positive, I just lost all of those ambitions. I sort of wandered around in a daze for like a year, just thinking like, wow, something huge has to change in my life. And I can't picture exactly what it is.
The antiretroviral drugs in common use today wouldn't become available for another 5 years. And so during this period, he watched as many of his friends died.
There really were no effective treatments for HIV at the time when I tested positive. I didn't exactly take it as a death sentence and think like, oh my God, I'm going to be dead in 5 years or something like that. But I guess I took it as a wake-up call.
Then another life-changing event. Through a chance conversation at a party, he heard about a small community living up a mountain in a remote part of Tennessee.
I was so shocked that such a thing could exist and very intrigued as they were telling me stories of milking the goats and keeping this 200-year-old cabin together. And it made me curious to check it out and come visit them.
Which led to his first journey into a place that was to become his home.
I remember that night being just struck by how clear the sky was and being able to see the stars. And I was very enchanted. At that time, it was maybe 15 people and everybody shared one kitchen. So, everybody had dinner together every night. We would have fresh vegetables really all year round. In the winter, we would do cold frames. We had an orchard with fresh fruit. We had our own eggs and we had milk.
During this period, at what point does fermentation become important to you?
In the first year that I moved down here, I learned how to make pickles, miso. Sauerkraut was my gateway. That was the first thing that I made.
In his kitchen, the cucumbers we picked are cut into chunks and placed in a mild brine in a jar to make pickles. The blueberries are placed in another jar of water and will slowly become a naturally carbonated drink. But the main task is to transform a fresh cabbage into sauerkraut.
Many people, including me when I started doing this, assume that there must be something specific that you have to do to get the right bacteria to grow. It is just so utterly simple. And I'm just lightly sprinkling salt. I mean, I don't measure the salt.
I guess the important thing is the contact between as much of the cabbage as possible and the salt.
Exactly. Salt isn't the source of the bacteria. Salt isn't necessary to keep it safe. Salt is necessary to keep the texture good. So you can vary what vegetables, you can vary the texture and how you cut the vegetables, you can vary the salt content, you can vary the seasoning, and then the most important variable of all is you can vary the time, the length of time that you allow it to ferment. What I learned the first time I taught a sauerkraut making workshop is that there's a lot of fear. Lots of people wanted to know, how can I be sure that I have good bacteria growing in this jar of fermenting cabbage and not something dangerous? The last thing I want to do is kill somebody. And so since I'd never really thought about that question before, it caused me to go and do some research about the safety of sauerkraut. Find out, is there any case history of food poisoning or botulism or anything like that from sauerkraut? And I learned that there isn't.
That research led him to start writing about fermentation.
I made a little booklet and I called it Wild Fermentation with the subtitle A Do-It-Yourself Guide to Cultural Manipulation. And I made 100 copies and I did a lot of research in that process.
The booklet became a book that's since sold worldwide, published initially with a 5-month tour of small food shops and bookstores.
But it became evident to me very, very quickly that there was broader interest in this topic than I had anticipated. And I've gotten invitations, all around the world to teach about fermentation, which also means I get to learn about fermentation in different places. It is fair to say that what started as a book tour has never quite ended.
Meanwhile, in Sandor's kitchen, the cabbage is already undergoing rapid change. Chopping and adding salt has started a transformation.
We'll go ahead and sprinkle a final little bit of salt on this. And then I'm going to get in there and start mixing it all around and squeezing. So now we can see, the vegetables that were on the bottom now have a little sheen of water on them. So we didn't add any water. That's just water from the vegetables that the salt is pulling out. And now we're going to augment that. You can hear that sort of squeaky sound. That's me squeezing the cabbage. It's basically going to wilt and reduce in volume as I do this, and then just get juicier and juicier. You're just squeezing the veggies and, trying to bruise them up a little bit, get the cell walls to break. And then at some point I can begin to lift up a handful and squeeze it, and maybe you can hear that there's all this juice that is sort of freed from the vegetables at this point. Let me just address the question of, is fermentation universal? Is fermentation practiced everywhere? Since I developed this interest in fermentation, I've been looking for counterexamples, examples of places where fermentation is not part of the culinary tradition, and I have not been able to find any.
You're listening to The Food Chain on the BBC World Service with me, Dan Saladino, and we're exploring the magic of fermented foods with an expert in the field.
Sandor Katz has studied fermentation techniques around the world, covering traditions in Africa, Latin America, Europe and Asia, from kimchi in Korea to miso in Japan, and an endless range of techniques found in China.
There's fermentation of rice and sorghum and other grains into alcohol. There's fermentation of soybeans into soy sauce, of other beans into fermented bean pastes. There's lots of fermentation of tofu, of vegetables. Really all the historic literature addressing sauerkraut talks about the idea that the nomadic people of Central Asia encountered fermented vegetables in China and spread the idea westward into Europe from China. So now I'm just going to basically fill the jar with shredded, salted, juniper berried cabbage. And then when you think that the jar is full, I'm just going to use my hands for this.
With your fingers just inside the jar, you're putting pressure so it's compressing.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of force out the air pockets, force the kraut down, and force the liquid up.
Meanwhile, inside the jar holding the kraut, fermentation is getting underway. A succession of bacteria will start working on the cabbage, submerged in its own juices, protected from the air. A process over days and weeks that will result in the awe-inspiring dominance of lactic acid bacteria. Nutrients will be created, preservation enhanced, flavors developed.
So here's one you made earlier, and this is a kraut that's 4 days old.
Yeah, 4 days. I mean, I'll like it more and more for the next couple of weeks, but I feel like at this stage of its development, it has a really appealing, moderate flavor. There's caraway in this. That's usually my go-to seasoning for sauerkraut is caraway.
That is delicious. Crunchy and squeaky.
It's got that squeaky, doesn't it?
Yeah. In the books, you are extremely measured and careful in what you say about fermentation as a solution to health problems and issues. But in your own personal experience, how would you describe the importance of fermentation and the role of the foods that you are producing when it comes to your well-being?
They make me feel really good when I eat them. Like I have a feeling that they are nourishing and sustaining to me. And because they're such a regular feature of my life, I would say what's really striking to me is when I'm in situations where I don't have access to them. You know, I really experience my digestion slowing down. You know, beyond that, there's excellent documentation of ways in which eating bacteria-rich foods, stimulate immunity. And as an individual person, it's a little bit hard to gauge that. But I would say that, through these decades of living with this like immune deficiency syndrome, I'd say still somehow my overall immune function has been generally pretty good. And I would attribute at least some measure of that to the regular consumption of fermented foods. I've seen people profile me and say that I had like cured HIV with fermented foods. And, let me just be very clear to the BBC and anyone who's listening that I've not cured HIV. I take HIV meds every day. And in general, I would say that when I hear people talk about fermented foods as cure for particular diseases, eat sauerkraut to cure cancer, drink kombucha to cure diabetes, like that, that's kind of a trigger for me. Like, I just think it's not reasonable to expect eating a particular food is going to cure a particular disease. And I don't mean to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because I think that these foods can be very, very powerful and healing. What I would say is that foods that can potentially improve digestion and nutrient assimilation, foods that can potentially improve immune function and mental health and more, those are benefits that we all can enjoy. And that's not the same as curing any particular disease. So, I think that, thinking about fermentation and fermented foods in the context of a broader diet, they don't replace fresh foods, they augment fresh foods. And I think that food can be very, very powerful in lots of different ways.
Back to the jars of sauerkraut.
I feel like I'm watching something that I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life now.
I can't believe you've made it this far without doing this.
I've been too busy, Sandor.
I realize a lot of people have busy lives. I have a busy life too. My major observation is that if you invest a little bit of time doing something like this, you will find that in your busy life, when you find yourself, eating on the run, making a little sandwich and scarfing it down before you run out the door or something, if you have sauerkraut sitting around, it makes all of those meals on the run so much more substantive and so much more nutritious. Literally, I could have done this in 10 minutes and just been done with it and had a supply of kraut that I could enjoy for a couple of weeks. So that's about it. This is sauerkraut. It's very, very simple.
And perhaps if we all made a jar of sauerkraut, we might grow to love something that for generations we've been told to fear: bacteria.
It's almost as if like the sexiest thing you can say in marketing anything is promising that your product will kill 99.9% of bacteria. Louis Pasteur, in the mid-19th century, first identified fermentation as a life process, and then also started researching bacteria more broadly. And so, in the early emergence of the field of microbiology, the first triumphs involved identifying pathogenic bacteria. And so now there are two bits of information. One is that there exist in the world, these tiny beings called bacteria that are everywhere. And then the second piece of information is some of these bacteria can make us sick and are the vectors of disease. And so I would say in the popular imagination, bacteria became equated with danger, disease, and death.
Sandor Katz's teachings and his books, including the award-winning and encyclopedic The Art of Fermentation and Wild Fermentation, are all part of his quest to help us rebuild the link between our food and microbes. With Sandor, I'd made sauerkraut, started a carbonated drink with freshly picked blueberries, and placed cucumbers from his garden in brine to make pickles. A few days after I returned home, an unusual email arrived. All of the fresh food we'd started to ferment was alive and fizzing. Sandor wanted me to know that, and with his phone he'd sent me the sounds of the ferments unfolding inside the jars.
Hello, Sandor.
Hello, Dan.
I'm now back in the UK, and some of the things that we worked on together, I think there's been some progress. What's happening at your end?
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Actually, just a little while ago, I sampled one of the pickles that we made, and they're crunchy and sour and delicious. And the berry soda is so vigorously bubbling, and it has such a beautiful blueberry flavor. I wish I could share a taste of it with you.
So it's good news and bad news. The good news is that it's worked and it sounds delicious. The bad news is I'm not with you and I can't taste it. But one bit of news from my end, Sandor, is that last night I got a cabbage and a jar and some salt, and I've just started to make my first sauerkraut, thanks to you.
I wish you the best of success with that.
I'll let you know how it goes.
Super.
My journey with Sandor has come to an end. We'd love to hear what you think. Find us on social media using the hashtag BBC Food Chain. For now, from me, Dan Saladino, and the rest of the Food Chain team, thanks for listening, and join us again for the Food Chain next week. All previous episodes of the Food Chain are available to download. And another podcast from the BBC World Service you might like, The Conversation. Each week, two women from two cultures talk about the passion or experience they have in common. Amazing stories, compelling conversations.